Curious Lloyd.
They say you can learn from history, but first of all, you have to understand it. But you need to find pretty strong evidence to start believing it in the first place. But in this video, I shall explain 5 pretty compelling historic facts, which you'll probably find very hard to believe, due to the fact they don't teach you anything like this in school now. So here are 5 ways you're picturing history wrong. Huge medieval battles were seriously rare. Historical documentaries like Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings have taught us that medieval warfare was a sprawling, terrifying spectacle. Rows of mounted cavalry, as far as the eye can see, ranks of men with colourful shields and pikes, with an ocean of CGI armoured troops behind them. Although, the reality is, I'm not entirely saying that type of stuff never happened, but the battle you're seeing now certainly did. I'm saying that for instance, the famed conqueror, Richard the Lionheart, fought a massive 3 battles in his entire career. Henry V, one of France's most famous leaders, fought one. Even the most famous medieval battles, like the historic English victories at Crécy and Agincourt, only served as prologues to the whole lot of sieging. The much more common warfare tactic, in which armies simply camped out around the castle or towns for months or years until the people inside ran out of food and usually surrendered. But the truth is that large pitched battles went down in the history books specifically because they were so unusual. But you're all probably thinking, why? Well, despite all the speeches Mr. Richard the Lionheart told about all the glories of combat, in reality, you always prefer the path to victory that doesn't get your men half slaughtered to pieces. But armies, after all, are expensive, so rather than agree to have your 20,000 men meet their 20,000 in a scenic open field, armies would only look to engage if victory was all to be assured, in which case, the weaker side would try to hole up in a castle and turn the affair into a usually boring siege. Otherwise, open combat was to be avoided if at all possible, with leaders much preferring to pick away at the enemy with raids, which would help them capture a stronghold at a time. But most of the fighting wasn't exactly the kind of stuff they write heroic poems about. Pillaging was the primary tactic of the day, mainly because, while you and I like to imagine epic conflicts fought over freedom, faith, and murdered kings, most wars were fought over economic issues like property rights. Since peasants were essentially a resource, they provided food and tax revenue. Terrorizing them was an easy way to hurt the enemy without the risk of taking an arrow. On the rare occasion, when large battles did happen, only armies commanded by the totally stupid would descend into the usual trope of 2 forces that fire a few rounds of arrows and then start throwing swords at each other in a chaotic free-for-all. Scouts and spies were used to track the enemy movement. Armies used terrain, trenches, and tactical positioning to try and gain an advantage, and they would try to hide their forces if possible. Commanders studied past battles and textbooks and were analysed and revised, but they couldn't throw waves of men at each other. They didn't have them to spare, because fit and healthy men and women were very hard to come by in those days. So in every scene in which a hero leads a courageous charge into the teeth of the enemy lines, is actually showing that he's kind of an idiot. Only a true hero would be slaughtering confused peasants and stealing their cattle and food and resources. Great Britain wasn't an island until fairly recently. You probably remember from various geography classes that all the continents used to be connected, but slowly drifted apart over the course of millions and millions of years. But still, we assume that the world map looked pretty much as it does now for all human history. At the very least, geology does take its time. Anyway, Britain may have recently voted to leave the European Union, but that's not the first time we've quit on the continent, and the last time was even more chaotic and confusing than Brexit, because not too many thousand years ago, Britain was physically torn away from Europe. During the tail end of the last ice age 12,000 years ago, what we know now as the island of Great Britain formed the upper corner of the European mainland. The massive chunk of land connecting Britain and Europe was called Doggerland. This wasn't some random icy wasteland either. Doggerland was well populated. Modern fishermen have occasionally hauled up spears and mammoth bones, and archaeologists recently acquired technology that allows them to explore the presumably magical kingdom that's hidden under our English Channel and the North Sea. Scientists are trying to create a 3D map of the lost landmass using seabed mapping technology, and they even plan to pull up DNA samples to see exactly who the Doggerland people were. Doggerland had a huge problem also. It was all lowlands. Once the ice sheets began to melt and the sea started to rise, Doggerland pulled an Atlantis. In 7500 BC, a giant landslide off the coast of Norway created a tsunami that tore through the region. By 6000 BC, the people still clinging to the vanishing surface started moving to the higher grounds of what would become the Netherlands and the British Isles. Doggerland then disappeared completely by 5000 BC. Stonehenge was a part of a vast network of monuments. Stonehenge is one of those places that most people have heard about, but only vaguely understands it, kind of like the stock market. It's a 5,000-year-old monument that used to be a burial ground or an ancient calendar. It's mysterious and looks oh so cool, but ultimately, it's a bunch of rocks standing around in a field. And sure, there are some parts missing, but you can still picture what it would have looked like back when it was new. Well, every discovery that scientists make about Stonehenge makes it more mysterious, but back in its day, Stonehenge looked something like this. But more recent discoveries indicate at least 17 other Neolithic shrines buried in the area. In 2014, a team of archaeologists finished a 4-year radar technology survey that discovered impressions left by wood, stones and ditches, some following the same layout as Stonehenge. That would mean Stonehenge was a massive miles-wide complex used to perform rituals that scientists are 90% sure were creepy. A year later though, there was an even bigger find. The remains of 90 giant stones arranged in a C shape, buried under a grassy bank a mere 2 miles from Stonehenge. This was called the Durrington Walls. The fixture is a mile in circumference, and is overshadowed by an even larger foundation nearby, a 1.8 mile monstrosity known as the Cursus. Cursus had a big pit at both ends. The east pit is aligned with the avenue that used to lead to Stonehenge, while the west pit is aligned with the Stonehenge's heel stone. The avenue and the heel stone line up perfectly with the light of the sun during dawn and dusk, respectively, of the summer solstice, which is an impressive bit of engineering for people of their time. Durrington Walls, meanwhile, is thought to have once been a site of a building where defleshing was performed during burial rites. But defleshing is exactly what it sounds like. So Stonehenge wasn't just a spooky ceremonial site sitting alone in the wilderness. It was the centre of a major hub of ritual and professional activity. The fact that its creators left no written records may doom us to endless speculation, but additional research could offer some clues in the near future. The Amazon jungle was once home to massive cities. What do you picture when you imagine the tribes of the Amazon rainforest? People in loincloths for countless generations, small mud huts and the occasional animal attack. But how about vast interconnected cities in which millions of people lived? Well, it's easy to think of the Amazon as a giant patch of impenetrable greenery, populated by isolated tribes, because that's essentially what it is today. But more and more archaeologists are thinking that the Amazon used to hold massive cities with a combined population of as many as 50 million people. Recent evidence suggests that at the end of the 15th century, the Amazon was as developed as Europe, complicated networks of roads connected cities, and the people weren't savages. They destroyed hundreds of thousands of acres of forest to establish farmland. The modern Amazon, which we think of a pristine virgin rainforest, is in a large part of regrowth over once domesticated land. But we've known about this since the first Spanish explorers arrived in South America in the 16th century. But when the Europeans marched in, the vast majority of Amazonians succumbed to their foreign diseases. Nature quickly reclaimed the land, so later explorers only found the radically diminished low-tech population we tend to think of as the entirety of the Amazonian culture. It was only once we started using sophisticated excavation techniques and technology like ground-penetrating radar that we were able to uncover this lost civilization. We may never know much about their culture, but at least their legacy lives on. Cavemen were smarter than you think, and probably didn't live in caves. Well, first of all, they probably didn't even live in caves. Early archaeologists just made this assumption when they first started finding old bones and paintings preserved for millions of years in caves. Modern archaeologists have since found evidence of early human life far from any caves, and they now suspect that caves may barely have been used for residence at all. Caves previously thought to be homes may have in fact been carefully prepared burial sites, which would explain all the skeletons and artwork in them. There's also no good reason to think that early hominids were any less intelligent than us, but Neanderthals are believed to have used complex hunting methods to trick mammoths into falling into ravines, indicating they were techniques for communication and advanced planning. There's also evidence that they made some form of sealant tar, which took Homo sapiens until the late Middle Ages to mass produce. Anthropologists also believe that Homo erectus had the technology to build and navigate seafaring boats. With all that brainpower, it's also unlikely that cavemen communicated with the simplistic of word phrases generally associated with them. Our ancestors from 15,000 years ago had such intricate language that we still use some of their words today. There's also evidence of hominid altruism, such as 1 to 2 million year old skeletons with decayed bones and teeth, indicating that they would have had trouble walking and eating without assistance. In other words, they died far older than they should have been able to survive on their own, implying that their friends and family cared for them, or at least benefited from their wisdom. Ancient man carried their loved ones through the hinterlands, full of constant dangers, and gave up some of their precious few resources to keep them alive, while we stick our parents when we get older in nursing homes. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and I will catch you again next week. And if you enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button. I'd just like to say thank you for making me hit 1,000 subscribers. Your support is greatly appreciated.